The clinking of champagne flutes and the low hum of moneyed conversation at Aurelia, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, was shattered by a single arrogant voice. "Do you know who I am?" The words, laced with venom and privilege, dripped from the lips of Adrian Wilder, a man whose net worth could buy the entire city block. His target, a young waitress named Isla, whose only crime was an accidental spill. But Adrian didn't see an accident. He saw an opportunity to assert his dominance. What he couldn't possibly know was that this seemingly insignificant waitress held a secret that could dismantle his entire empire. Her calm, unexpected reply wouldn't just get him thrown out. It would ignite a firestorm that would threaten to burn his billion-dollar legacy to the ground. This isn't just a story about a waitress and a billionaire. It's a battle of wills, where the price of arrogance is a fall from grace, so spectacular it becomes a legend. The air in Aurelia, a name whispered with reverence among New York City's elite, was thick with the scent of truffle oil, aged leather, and old money. It was a place where deals that shaped the skyline were closed over plates of seared scallops and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. The lighting was meticulously designed to be dim and flattering, casting a golden glow on the faces of power brokers, heiresses, and the occasional celebrity seeking refuge from the flash of paparazzi cameras. The clinking of silverware against bespoke porcelain was a delicate symphony, a soundtrack to the quiet murmur of conversations that could sway markets and launch careers. Into this meticulously curated world of opulence walked Isla Rossi, a 24-year-old, with eyes that held a story far deeper than her years suggested. To the patrons of Aurelia, she was just another part of the scenery, a fleeting presence in a crisp white uniform. Her dark hair pulled back in a severe but elegant knot. She moved with a practiced grace, her steps light and her smile discreet. A ghost flitting between tables laden with the finest cuisine money could buy. But beneath the veneer of the deferential waitress was a spirit forged in the fires of adversity, a quiet observer who saw the cracks in the gilded cage that was Aurelia. Isla had been working at Aurelia for just over a year, a job she had secured through a combination of grit and a reference from a family friend of the owner. It was a world away from her upbringing in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, a world she was still trying to understand. She was an artist at heart, her small apartment filled with canvases that captured the raw, unfiltered beauty of the city, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of Aurelia. The job was a means to an end, a way to pay for her art supplies, and a tiny studio space where she could escape the pressures of her double life. Tonight, the restaurant was buzzing with its usual energy. Isla glided through her section, her mind a carefully organized Rolodex of orders, dietary restrictions, and the subtle cues of her diners. She was adept at the art of being present, but invisible of anticipating needs before they were spoken. It was a delicate dance, and she was a master of its choreography. At a corner table nestled in a plush velvet banquette sat Adrian Wilder. To the uninitiated, he was just another wealthy man in a bespoke suit, his face etched with the kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of having the world bend to his will. But to anyone who followed the pulse of the financial world, Adrian Wilder was a titan, a predator in a Savile Row suit. He was the CEO of Wilder Industries, a global conglomerate with its fingers in everything from real estate to technology. His name was a regular feature in the glossy pages of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, his fortune estimated to be in the tens of billions. Adrian was dining with two associates, both men with the same predatory gleam in their eyes. their conversation a low growl of stock options and hostile takeovers. He was in his element, the king in his court, the master of his universe. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted when he wanted it, and he treated the staff of Aurelia with a thinly veiled contempt, as if they were mere automatons programmed to serve his every whim. Isla had served Adrian Wilder before. She knew his preferences: steak-cooked rare, almost blue, a bottle of the 1982 Chateau Margaux, and an almost pathological need to assert his dominance over everyone in his vicinity. She approached his table with the same professional calm. She afforded all her guests her face a mask of polite neutrality. "Good evening, Mr. Wilder," she said, her voice a soft melody against the harsh cadence of his conversation. "May I get you and your guests another bottle of the Margaux?" Adrian didn't even bother to look at her. He simply waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that said, "You are nothing." "Just bring it." He snapped his attention already back on his companions. Isla retreated to the wine cellar, the chill of the air a welcome respite from the suffocating arrogance of Adrian's table. She retrieved the bottle, its label a testament to its exorbitant price, and returned to the dining room. As she approached the table, one of Adrian's associates, a man named Marcus Thorne, with a laugh that was more of a bray, shifted in his seat, his arm knocking a half-full glass of water. The glass toppled its contents, cascading onto the pristine white tablecloth, and to Isla's horror, splashing onto the sleeve of Adrian Wilder's custom-made suit. The world seemed to slow down. The murmur of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in Isla's ears. She saw the dark stain spread across the expensive fabric, a blemish on the perfect facade of Adrian's world. Adrian Wilder looked down at his sleeve as if he had been bitten by a venomous snake. His face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, contorted into a grotesque mask of fury. His eyes, the color of cold steel, locked onto Isla. "You clumsy fool," he hissed, his voice low and menacing, yet carrying across the now silent restaurant. Every eye in the room was on them, the drama of the scene, a welcome distraction from their own gilded lives. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wilder." Isla began, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "It was an accident." "An accident?" Adrian's voice rose a crescendo of unrestrained rage. "This is a $10,000 suit. Do you have any idea what you've done?" He was no longer just a man with a stained suit. He was a volcano erupting his fury, a molten lava that threatened to consume everything in its path. The other diners, who moments before had been engrossed in their own worlds, were now a captivated audience, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Isla stood her ground, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had faced down bullies before, in the schoolyards of Queens and in the cutthroat world of the city's art scene. She would not be intimidated by this man, no matter how many billions he had in the bank. "It was an unfortunate accident, sir," she repeated, her voice still calm, a stark contrast to his escalating fury. "Allow me to get you some club soda and a cloth. We can also have the suit professionally cleaned at the restaurant's expense." Her composure seemed to enrage him further. He was not used to being met with calm rationality when he was in a rage. He was used to people cowering, apologizing profusely, their fear a balm to his bruised ego. "The restaurant's expense?" He scoffed, his laughter a harsh, grating sound. "You think a few dollars for dry cleaning can fix this? This is about more than just the suit. It's about incompetence. It's about a complete lack of respect." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the polished marble floor. The sound a shriek of indignation. He stood up, towering over Isla, a formidable figure of wealth and power. "I want you fired," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "I want you out of this restaurant, out of this industry. Do you know who I am? I am Adrian Wilder. I can have you blacklisted from every reputable establishment in this city. You will never work as a waitress again." The threat hung in the air, a palpable entity. To the other diners, it was a moment of high drama, a clash between the haves and the have-nots. They saw a powerful man exercising his privilege, a waitress on the verge of losing her livelihood. But they didn't see what was really happening. They didn't see the flicker of something in Isla's eyes, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. They didn't see the ghost of a memory, a past trauma that had prepared her for this very moment. And they certainly didn't see the silent signal that passed between Isla and the restaurant manager, a man named Julian Croft, who had been watching the scene unfold from the edge of the dining room. The stage was set. The players were in position, but the script that was about to unfold was one that no one, not even the great Adrian Wilder, could have ever predicted. The calm reply that was about to leave Isla's lips would not just be a defense of her job, it would be the first shot in a war that would shake the very foundations of Adrian's gilded world. And it would all start with 3 simple words that would change everything. The silence in Aurelia was no longer the comfortable, moneyed hush of before. It was a tense, brittle thing, stretched taut like a violin string about to snap. Every diner, every member of the staff held their breath, their eyes glued to the drama unfolding at the corner table. Adrian Wilder, his face a thunderous mask of indignation, stood over Isla Rossi, the full weight of his billion-dollar empire bearing down on her. The air crackled with his fury, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. "You will never work as a waitress again." He repeated, his voice a low, menacing growl, each word a carefully aimed dart intended to wound and intimidate. Isla, however, did not flinch. She did not cower. She did not beg for his forgiveness. Instead, a strange sense of calm washed over her, a placid lake in the midst of a raging hurricane. It was a calm born not of naivety, but of a deep, unshakable strength that had been forged in the crucible of a life far more challenging than Adrian Wilder could ever imagine. She met his gaze, her dark eyes clear and unwavering. And then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent room with a clarity that cut through the tension like a knife. "Is that so, Mr. Wilder?" The question, simple and direct, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the blustering rage of the man before her. It was not a question of defiance, but of genuine curiosity. It was as if she was a scientist observing a particularly fascinating, if somewhat volatile, specimen. Adrian was taken aback. He had expected tears pleading a complete and utter capitulation to his will. He had not expected this unnerving calm. It was like punching a pillow. There was no satisfying impact, no recoil, just a soft, unyielding resistance. "What did you say to me?" He sputtered, his face flushing a deeper shade of crimson. "I asked if that is so." Isla repeated, her voice, still, even her gaze, still locked on his. "Are you truly so powerful that you can dictate the course of my entire life over a spilled glass of water?" The audacity of her words sent a ripple of shock through the room. A waitress, a nobody, was challenging Adrian Wilder, the master of the universe. It was a scene straight out of a movie, a David and Goliath moment, playing out in the heart of one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. Before Adrian could unleash the fresh wave of fury that was building within him, a new player entered the scene. Julian Croft, the restaurant manager, glided to the table, his movements smooth and practiced. He was a man in his late 40s with silvering temples and a face that had seen it all. He had a reputation for being discreet, unflappable, and fiercely protective of his staff. "Mr. Wilder," Julian said, his voice a calming balm in the heated atmosphere. "Is there a problem here?" "A problem?" Adrian whirled on him, grateful for a new target for his rage. "Your incompetent waitress has ruined a $10,000 suit and has the audacity to question my authority. I want her fired, now, or I will not only never set foot in this establishment again, but I will make it my personal mission to see to it that no one I know ever does either." The threat was a powerful one. Adrian Wilder's patronage was a badge of honor for any restaurant, his influence a powerful tool that could make or break a business. Julian listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He then turned his gaze to Isla, a silent question in his eyes. The gentleman's associate knocked a glass of water onto Mr. Wilder's suit. Isla explained, her voice still a model of composure. "I apologized and offered to have the suit professionally cleaned at the restaurant's expense." Julian nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. The furious billionaire, the calm waitress, the two associates who now looked distinctly uncomfortable, and the room full of captivated diners. "I see," Julian said, his voice still carefully neutral. He then turned back to Adrian. "Mr. Wilder, I understand your frustration. However, accidents do happen. Isla is one of our finest employees, and I assure you this was not a result of incompetence." "I don't care what you think," Adrian roared, his patience completely gone. "I want her gone. Are you deaf? Fire her." Julian's calm demeanor finally began to crack a subtle shift in his posture, a hardening of his eyes. He had dealt with difficult customers before, with men and women who believed their wealth entitled them to treat others with contempt. But there was something about Adrian Wilder's brand of arrogance that was particularly vile. "Mr. Wilder," Julian said, his voice now tinged with an edge of steel, "I will not be firing Miss Rossi. She has done nothing to warrant such a drastic action." A collective gasp went through the room. The manager was defying Adrian Wilder. This was a battle of wills, a clash of two immovable objects. Adrian's face contorted into a mask of disbelief. "You're refusing me. You're choosing a nobody waitress over me." "I am choosing to uphold the dignity of my staff and the integrity of this establishment," Julian replied, his voice ringing with a conviction that resonated through the room. "We do not tolerate the abuse of our employees, no matter how wealthy or powerful the guest may be." The words were a direct challenge, a line drawn in the sand. The other diners, who had initially been a mix of shocked and amused, now looked on with a newfound respect for the manager. They were witnessing a rare moment of a principle taking precedence over profit. Adrian Wilder was speechless. He was a man who was used to the world bending to his will, a man who had never been told no in his life. He was a king who had just been informed that his decrees held no power in this particular kingdom. But the real twist, the one that would turn this high-stakes drama into a legend, whispered in the halls of New York's elite for years to come, was yet to be revealed. And it was Isla who held the key. She had remained silent throughout the exchange between Julian and Adrian, her face a mask of quiet observation. But now she spoke again, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Julian," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Perhaps it's time." Julian looked at her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Adrian, momentarily forgotten, looked back and forth between the waitress and the manager, a flicker of confusion on his face. "Time for what?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of anger and bewilderment. Isla turned her calm, unwavering gaze back to him. The deference was gone, replaced by something else, something that Adrian couldn't quite decipher. It was a look of quiet power, of a secret knowledge that was about to be unveiled. "Mr. Wilder," she said, her voice as cool and clear as the water that had stained his expensive suit. "My full name is Isla Rossi. Isla de la Cruz Rossi." The name hung in the air, seemingly insignificant to Adrian. "So what?" he sneered. "Am I supposed to be impressed by your fancy middle name?" But he was the only one in the room who didn't understand. To the other diners, to the staff, to anyone who knew anything about the world of high-end hospitality in New York City, the name De La Cruz was a name of immense significance. It was the name of the man who owned Aurelia, the man who owned a string of the most exclusive, most successful restaurants in the city, the man who was a legend in the industry, a phantom figure who rarely made public appearances, but whose influence was felt everywhere. A man named Santiago de la Cruz, Isla's grandfather. The calm waitress who Adrian Wilder had just threatened to have fired, to have blacklisted from the industry, was the heiress to the very empire he was dining in. The realization dawned on Adrian's face, a slow-motion wave of horror and disbelief. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, sickly pallor. The master of the universe was suddenly a very small, very foolish man, in a very expensive, very stained suit. The calm reply had been delivered. The storm was about to break, and Adrian Wilder was standing right in the middle of it. The revelation of Isla's full name, Isla de la Cruz Rossi, settled over the dining room of Aurelia like a physical weight. The name de la Cruz, in the context of this restaurant, was not just a name. It was an institution. It was a legacy. And to the assembled patrons, it was a thunderclap of a plot twist that made their seared foie gras and vintage wines seem utterly pedestrian in comparison. Adrian Wilder's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. The initial arrogant fury had dissolved into a slack-jawed disbelief, which was now rapidly being replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. He was a man who prided himself on knowing everyone who mattered, on having a mental Rolodex of power and influence. How could he have missed this? How could the unassuming waitress, the object of his unrestrained scorn, be connected to the almost mythical Santiago de la Cruz? He stared at Isla, really looked at her for the first time. He saw now what he had been blind to, before the quiet confidence that was not the civility of a waitress, but the self-assurance of someone who belonged. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, an intelligence that was not just about remembering orders, but about understanding people, about seeing through the facade of wealth and power to the core of the person beneath. De la Cruz. He stammered the word, a dry whisper in his throat. Santiago de la Cruz is your... He is my grandfather, Isla finished for him, her voice even devoid of any hint of triumph or gloating. She was simply stating a fact that had just detonated in the middle of Adrian Wilder's perfectly curated world. A low murmur swept through the room as the other diners connected the dots. The story was now complete, the picture in sharp, stunning focus. The billionaire who had threatened to have the waitress fired had just done so to the granddaughter of the man who owned the entire restaurant chain. The irony was so thick, so delicious, that it was almost a physical taste in the air. Adrian's two associates, Marcus Thorne and the other man whose name was David Chen, looked as if they wanted the plush velvet banquette to swallow them whole. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape route. Their association with Adrian, which just moments before had been a badge of honor, was now a mark of shame. Julian Croft. The manager stepped forward, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "Mr. Wilder," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority, an authority that was backed by the unseen but ever-present power of Santiago de la Cruz. "I believe it is time for you and your guests to leave." It was not a request. It was an order. Adrian, for the first time in what was likely a very, very long time, was utterly lost for words. His mind, usually a sharp calculating machine, was a jumble of panicked thoughts. He had built his empire on a foundation of intimidation and power plays on the carefully cultivated fear of others. But he had just tried to intimidate the one person he should have been trying to impress. He had picked a fight with the princess in her own castle. I didn't know," he finally managed to say, his voice a pathetic squeak that was a far cry from the booming roar of before. "If I had known who she was. And that is the problem, isn't it, Mr. Wilder?" Isla's voice cut through his stammering excuse. For the first time there was a hint of steel in her tone, a glimpse of the fire that had been smoldering beneath her calm exterior. "You believe that a person's worth is determined by their name, by their connections, by the size of their bank account." She continued, her voice rising with a passion that captivated the entire room. "You treated me with contempt because you saw me as a nobody waitress. You felt entitled to abuse me, to threaten my livelihood, because you believed you were superior. Would you have treated me differently if you had known I was a De La Cruz?" The question hung in the air, a damning indictment of his character. And they both knew the answer. Of course he would have. He would have been charming, obsequious, a completely different person. "My grandfather taught me that the true measure of a person is not how they treat their equals, but how they treat those they believe to be beneath them." Ela said, her words a quiet sermon that held the room in rapt attention. "He taught me that dignity is not something that can be bought or sold, but something that is inherent in every human being, whether they are a billionaire or a waitress." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the other diners, who were now listening with a mixture of awe and self-reflection. "He also taught me that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, no matter how powerful they are. Because if you don't, they will continue to believe that the world belongs to them, that they can treat people like dirt and get away with it." Adrian stood there, stripped bare of his power and his pride exposed as a petty, cruel man in a ridiculously expensive suit. The suit, which had been a symbol of his status, was now just a stained piece of cloth, a ridiculous costume in a play where he had been spectacularly miscast as the hero. He looked around the room at the faces of the people he had spent his life trying to impress, and saw only contempt and disgust. He had not just been thrown out of a restaurant, he had been excommunicated from the very society he had worked so hard to dominate. "Get out," Julian said again, his voice cold and final. He gestured to two large security guards who had materialized at the edge of the dining room, their presence a silent, menacing confirmation that the show was over. Adrian, his face a mask of shame and fury, finally moved. He stumbled back from the table, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He didn't even look at his associates. He was a defeated king, a fallen titan, and he was utterly alone. As he was escorted out of the restaurant, a pariah in the world, he had once ruled, a strange thing happened. The other diners, the silent audience to this real-life drama, broke into a spontaneous, thunderous round of applause. They were not just applauding the removal of a boorish customer. They were applauding Isla. They were applauding her courage, her dignity, her quiet strength. They were applauding the fact that for one night in the heart of New York City, justice had been served not by a court of law, but by a young waitress with a secret and the courage to speak truth to power. Isla stood there in the center of the room, the applause washing over her. A small, genuine smile finally graced her lips. It was not a smile of triumph, but of relief. The artist who had been hiding beneath the waitress uniform had finally painted her masterpiece not on a canvas, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed the downfall of Adrian Wilder. But the story was not over. The ripples of that night's events would spread far beyond the walls of Aurelia, setting in motion a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. For Adrian Wilder, it was the beginning of a public relations nightmare that would threaten to dismantle his entire empire. And for Isla de la Cruz Rossi, it was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter where she would finally embrace her true identity and the power that came with it. The calm reply had been delivered. The billionaire had been thrown out. But the real drama was just beginning. The expulsion of Adrian Wilder from Aurelia was not a quiet affair. In the age of social media, secrets, especially those involving the rich and powerful, have the life expectancy of a mayfly. By the time Adrian's sleek black limousine had sped away from the curb, its passenger stewing in a toxic brew of humiliation and rage, the story was already beginning to leak out into the digital ether. It started with a single tweet from a hedge fund manager who had been dining at a nearby table. Craziest thing just happened at Aurelia. Watched billionaire Adrian Wilder get thrown out after berating a waitress. Turns out she's the owner's granddaughter. You can't make this stuff up. #Adrian Wilder, Aurelia Ny Su. The tweet, with its irresistible blend of schadenfreude and high society drama, was like a match thrown on a gasoline-soaked pile of tinder. It was retweeted, screenshotted, and shared across every social media platform imaginable. Within the hour, the hashtag #WilderStain was trending on Twitter. Gossip columnists who lived for this kind of material descended on the story like vultures on a fresh kill. The initial reports were a jumble of rumors and speculation, but the core of the story remained the same. Adrian Wilder, the titan of industry, had been brought low by a young waitress and a spilled glass of water. By morning, the story had been picked up by mainstream news outlets. The New York Post ran a front-page headline that screamed, "Billionaire bully gets served." The Wall Street Journal, in a more restrained but no less damning article, questioned Wilder's temperament and its potential impact on his leadership of Wilder Industries. The story had all the elements of a modern-day fable, a beautiful, unassuming heroine, a monstrously arrogant villain, and a dramatic public comeuppance. Isla de la Cruz Rossi. The waitress heiress became an overnight sensation, a symbol of quiet defiance against the tyranny of the super-rich. For Adrian Wilder, the aftermath was a living nightmare. He woke up to a world that had turned against him. His phone was bombarded with calls from his public relations team, his board of directors, and a slew of reporters, all demanding a statement. He was a man who was used to controlling the narrative, to shaping his own public image. But the story of his humiliation at Aurelia was a runaway train, and he was tied to the tracks. His initial instinct was to fight back, to use his immense wealth and power to crush the story and discredit Ela. He summoned his team of high-powered lawyers and public relations experts to his penthouse office, a sterile glass and steel box high above the city, a fortress that suddenly felt like a prison. "I want you to sue them," he raged, pacing the floor like a caged animal. "Sue the restaurant. Sue the girl. Sue every news outlet that's running this garbage. I want to ruin them." His lead lawyer, a man named Robert Vance, who had made a career out of cleaning up Adrian's messes, shook his head slowly. "Adrian, that would be a catastrophic mistake," he said, his voice calm and measured. "We can't sue them for telling the truth. There were dozens of witnesses. You would be laughed out of court, and it would only make the story bigger." "So what do I do?" Adrian demanded, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never known. "You need to apologize," his head of PR, a sharp-witted woman named Clara Jenkins, said, her face grim. "A full, public, unconditional apology. You need to sound sincere, humble, and deeply remorseful." The word humble was like a foreign language to Adrian. It was not a concept he had ever had to entertain. But as he looked at the grim faces of his advisors, he realized he had no other choice. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and he was in very real danger of losing everything. The board of directors of Wilder Industries, a group of powerful men and women who were more concerned with the company's stock price than with Adrian's bruised ego, was already making noises about his fitness to lead. The company's stock had taken a significant hit in pre-market trading, and there were whispers of an emergency board meeting to discuss his future as CEO. Meanwhile, Isla was dealing with her own very different kind of aftermath. She woke up to a world that had suddenly discovered her. Her phone was buzzing with notifications, her social media accounts flooded with friend requests and messages of support. She was a reluctant celebrity, a folk hero in a Waitress uniform. Her grandfather, Santiago de la Cruz, a man who had spent his life avoiding the spotlight, called her first thing in the morning. He was a man of few words, but his voice was filled with a deep, quiet pride. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You did good, Isla. You did what was right." "I didn't do it to become famous, Grandpa," she said, a little overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "I know," he replied. "That's why you did good. You have your grandmother's fire. She would have been proud." The comparison to her late grandmother, a woman of immense strength and compassion, who had been the love of Santiago's life, was the highest praise he could offer. Julian Croft, the manager of Aurelia, also called. He informed her that the restaurant had been inundated with reservation requests, with people clamoring to dine at the scene of the now-famous takedown. He also told her that several of the diners from the previous night had called to express their admiration for her and to offer their support. One of those calls was from a woman named Eleanor Vance, a well-known philanthropist and a major player in the New York art scene. She had been so impressed by Isla's grace under pressure that she had looked her up online and discovered her artwork. She wanted to offer Isla a solo exhibition at her prestigious gallery in Chelsea. It was a dream come true, an opportunity that Isla had been working towards for years. It was a strange, almost surreal twist of fate that the ugliest night of her professional life had led to the most beautiful opportunity of her artistic life. But the story was far from over. The public apology that Adrian Wilder was being forced to make was still to come. And as the world waited to see if the billionaire bully had truly learned his lesson, a new unexpected player was about to enter the scene. A player who held a secret that could not only destroy what was left of Adrian's reputation, but could also unravel a dark chapter of his past that he had long thought buried. The stain on his suit was nothing compared to the stain on his soul, and the truth was about to come out. The public apology of Adrian Wilder was a meticulously crafted piece of public relations theatre. It was delivered not in a sterile press conference, but in a carefully chosen setting, a community centre in the Bronx, a place that was a world away from his usual gilded haunts. The optics were clear. The billionaire was humbling himself, coming down from his ivory tower to connect with the common man. He stood at a simple wooden podium, flanked by his lawyer, Robert Vance, and his PR chief, Clara Jenkins. He was dressed not in one of his usual power suits, but in a simple dark sweater and slacks, an outfit designed to make him look more approachable, more human. The room was filled with reporters and television cameras, all eager to capture the spectacle of the fallen titan's repentance. Adrian's face was a mask of rehearsed sincerity. He read from a prepared statement, his voice carefully modulated to convey a deep sense of remorse. "I stand before you today, a humbled man." He began, his eyes scanning the room. The events that transpired at Aurelia Restaurant were a moment of profound personal failure. There is no excuse for my behavior. I was arrogant, I was cruel, and I was wrong. He went on to apologize directly to Ayla, calling her by her full name, a name that now carried a weight that he had so foolishly underestimated. "To Miss Isla de la Cruz Rossi, I offer my most sincere and unreserved apology," he said, his voice thick with a carefully practiced emotion. "I treated her with a disrespect that no human being should ever have to endure. Her grace and dignity in the face of my inexcusable behavior were a powerful lesson, a lesson that I am only now beginning to understand." He announced that he was making a substantial donation to a charity that supported service industry workers, a gesture that was meant to show that his remorse was more than just empty words. He also announced that he was taking a leave of absence from Wilder Industries to reflect on his personal failings and to seek counseling for his anger management issues. The performance was, by all accounts, a masterful one. He hit all the right notes, said all the right words. Some of the more cynical reporters in the room may have seen it for the carefully orchestrated charade that it was. But to the wider public, it looked like a genuine act of contrition. The news cycle, ever hungry for a new story, began to shift. The narrative of the billionaire bully was slowly being replaced by the narrative of the redeemed billionaire, the man who had seen the error of his ways and was now on a path to self-improvement. Ila watched the apology on a television in the back office of Aurelia, a cup of tea warming her hands. She listened to his carefully chosen words, his performance of humility, and she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just a quiet, weary emptiness. She knew that his apology was not born of a genuine change of heart, but of a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation and his company's stock price. It was a business decision, not a moral one. But just as the world was ready to move on to accept Adrian Wilder's apology and file the story away as another fleeting moment of internet outrage, a new voice emerged. A ghost from Adrian's past who was about to turn his carefully crafted narrative of redemption into a raging inferno. Her name was Elena Petrova. She was a former employee of Wilder Industries, a bright, ambitious young woman who had worked as Adrian's executive assistant several years ago. She had been fired unceremoniously and without cause, and had been forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement that had silenced her for years. But now, emboldened by Isla's story, by the public's willingness to challenge Adrian's power, Elena decided that she could no longer remain silent. She contacted a reporter from a reputable investigative journalism outlet, a woman named Sarah Jensen, who had a reputation for fearless, in-depth reporting. Eleanor's story was a chilling one. She painted a picture of Adrian Wilder that was far darker than the arrogant bully who had been seen at Aurelia. She described a man who was not just verbally abusive, but who created a toxic work environment where fear and intimidation were the primary tools of management. She spoke of his rages, his demeaning comments, his habit of publicly humiliating employees for the smallest of mistakes. But she also spoke of something more sinister, a pattern of unwanted advances of inappropriate comments and late-night business meetings that felt more like a predator stalking his prey. She had never been physically assaulted, she was careful to clarify, but she had lived in a constant state of fear and anxiety. A fear that had been compounded by the knowledge that he was powerful enough to ruin her career if she dared to speak out. Her firing, she claimed, had been a direct result of her rebuffing his advances. The NDA she had signed had been her prison, a legal document that had bought her silence for a hefty sum. A sum that had felt like a small price to pay for her escape from his toxic orbit. But now she was ready to break it, to face the legal consequences, because she believed that the world needed to know the real Adrian Wilder. Sarah Jensen, the reporter, knew that this was a bombshell of a story, but she also knew that she needed to be careful. Adrian Wilder had a team of ruthless lawyers who would stop at nothing to protect him. She needed to corroborate Eleanor's story, to find other women who had similar experiences. And so she began to dig. She started with the list of former female employees who had left Wilder Industries under similar circumstances, women who had been fired abruptly and had signed NDAs. It was a long and difficult process, a journey into a world of secrets and fear. But as she spoke to these women, a pattern began to emerge, a chilling chorus of voices that all told the same story. They spoke of the same rages, the same demeaning comments, the same unwanted advances. They spoke of a man who used his power not just to build an empire, but to dominate and control the women who worked for him. The story was no longer about a spilled glass of water and a ruined suit. It was about a systemic abuse of power, a story of a man who had been allowed to operate with impunity for far too long. The calm reply of a waitress had not just gotten a billionaire thrown out of a restaurant. It had opened a Pandora's box of secrets and lies, a box that was about to unleash a storm that would not only destroy Adrian Wilder's career, but would also force a reckoning with the toxic culture of power and privilege that had allowed him to flourish for so long. The real drama was no longer playing out in the dining room of Aurelia, but in the newsrooms and boardrooms of New York City, and the final act was about to be a devastating one. Sarah Jensen's exposé on Adrian Wilder landed like a seismic charge, published simultaneously online and in print by the investigative journal The Vanguard. The headline was stark and uncompromising: "The Wilder Stain Beyond Arrogance, a Pattern of Abuse." The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, meticulously researched and devastatingly effective. It didn't just rehash the Aurelia incident. It used it as a jumping-off point to delve into the much darker, hidden history of Adrian Wilder's reign at his company. Elena Petrova's story was the centerpiece, her on-the-record account, a powerful and courageous indictment. But she was not alone. Jensen had found two other women, former employees from different departments and different years, who had agreed to speak anonymously, their stories corroborating Elena's with chilling precision. They described a corporate culture steeped in fear, a place where Adrian's volatile temper and inappropriate behavior were an open secret, a cost of doing business that everyone was forced to accept. The article detailed the use of ironclad non-disclosure agreements, not just as standard corporate practice, but as a weapon to silence and intimidate. It painted a picture of a man who believed he was above the rules, a predator who had insulated himself with a wall of money and legal power. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for Adrian Wilder. His carefully constructed apology tour, his performance of a humbled, redeemed man, was instantly shattered. He was revealed not as a man who had made a single public mistake, but as a serial abuser who had cultivated a private kingdom of toxicity. The board of directors of Wilder Industries, which had been cautiously optimistic after his public apology, was now in full-blown panic mode. The company's stock, which had begun to recover, plummeted, wiping out billions of dollars in market value in a matter of hours. The phrase fiduciary duty was on everyone's lips, and the pressure to oust Adrian was no longer a whisper, but a deafening roar. An emergency board meeting was convened, not in the company's gleaming headquarters, but in a neutral off-site location, a clear signal that Adrian's authority was gone. He was not even invited to attend the first part of the meeting. He was left to pace his penthouse apartment, the city lights glittering below him, like the mocking eyes of a world that had once been his to command. The board's decision when it came was swift and unanimous. Adrian Wilder was removed as CEO and chairman of the board of Wilder Industries, effective immediately. He was, for all intents and purposes, fired from the company that bore his name, the empire he had built. His leave of absence had become a permanent exile. The news broke, and the fallout was immense. Adrian Wilder was no longer just a social pariah. He was a business pariah. Banks called in loans partners backed out of deals, and the carefully constructed edifice of his power crumbled into dust. But the consequences were not just financial. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, prompted by the public outcry and the damning evidence in Jensen's article, announced that it was opening an investigation into the allegations of workplace harassment and the potential misuse of corporate funds to silence victims. Adrian Wilder, the man who had threatened to have a waitress blacklisted, was now facing the very real possibility of criminal charges. Amidst this maelstrom, Isla de la Cruz Rossi watched from the relative calm of her grandfather's world. Her life, too, had been irrevocably changed. The solo exhibition at Eleanor Vance's gallery was a resounding success. Her art, which had once been a private refuge, was now being celebrated by the very world she had once served. Her paintings, with their raw, honest portrayal of the city and its people, resonated with a public that was tired of the superficial and the contrived. She was hailed as a fresh new voice in the art world, her story lending a powerful narrative to her work. She never spoke publicly about Adrian Wilder again. She had said all she needed to say on that night at Aurelia. Her quiet defiance had been the spark, but the inferno that followed had taken on a life of its own. She did, however, receive a letter. It arrived not by courier or by email, but by regular mail, a simple, handwritten note on plain paper. It was from Adrian Wilder. He was not writing from his penthouse, but from a rehabilitation center in Arizona, a place where the rich and powerful went to confront their demons. The letter was not an apology in the way his public statement had been. It was something different, something more raw and more real. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said he did not deserve it. He simply wrote, "You were right. I built my world on a foundation of fear, and I became its first and most pathetic prisoner. I don't know if a man like me can ever truly change, but I have to try. Thank you for showing me the man I had become. I will never forget it." Isla read the letter, and for the first time since that night, she felt a pang of something akin to pity for the man who had tried to destroy her. He was a tragic figure, a king who had been so consumed by his own power that he had lost his own humanity. The story of Adrian Wilder and Isla de la Cruz Rossi became a legend in New York City, a modern-day fable that was told and retold in the restaurants and boardrooms, in the art galleries and the newsrooms. It was a story about the intoxicating, corrupting nature of power and the quiet, unshakable strength of a single human being who refused to be broken. It was a story that proved that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is not a billion-dollar fortune or a corporate empire, but the simple, unwavering courage to speak truth to power, to stand up for one's own dignity, and to deliver a calm, simple reply that can change the world. The stain on the suit had been washed away, but the stain on the soul was a much deeper, more indelible mark, a permanent reminder of the night a waitress brought a titan to his knees, and in doing so, found her own true power. The real-life drama had reached its stunning, unforgettable conclusion, and so the story of Adrian Wilder and Isla Rossi became a whispered legend in the hallowed halls of New York's elite. It served as a stark reminder that true power isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios, but in the quiet dignity with which we treat others. Isla's calm courage in the face of immense pressure showed the world that a single voice rooted in integrity can be enough to topple the most imposing of giants. Adrian's public downfall was a spectacle, but his private journey toward redemption, though just beginning, was the real story. What do you think? Was Adrian's punishment deserved, or was it too harsh? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of justice and unexpected twists, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will leave you breathless. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.